University Center for Community and Economic Development. Thank you for coming to our event today. And what we're going to do with this panel, our panelists will speak for about 5, 6, 7 minutes on topics related to media and technology and how that relates to incivility. But the hope for this panel is really to have an interactive discussion with both the panelists and with the audience as well. You're going to hear some different ideas and some possibly competing theories about the role that media and technology plays in incivility from our panelists, so hopefully this will spark some good discussion with our audience. I was reminded as we were putting this together, I always used to joke, I used to have a large number of employees at a previous job, and I always used to tell them I had 2 maxims about the use of technology, and it was really related to email. And actually, I never said the word maxim. My employees started referring to them as Berghorn's Maxim 1 and Berghorn's Maxim 2, which I thought was pretty good. I've arrived. I have maxims named after me. And maxim number 1 was, if you're feeling a little bit upset when you're sending an email, put it in your draft folder and go to sleep and reopen it the next morning. Seems to make sense. Sadly enough, very few people ever took me up on that little tidbit of advice, which made for much more interesting days to come. Maxim number 2 was never ever, under any circumstances, unless you can really justify it, ever should you hit reply all. Don't ever hit reply all. And I promise you, if you follow these 2 pieces of advice, you will have a happier life with email. You can thank me down the line. That being said, I'm really pleased to introduce a very, very distinguished and expert panel to speak about these issues with you today. I'm going to introduce our panelists and then let them get right into it. In the middle is Bill Ballinger. Bill was born in Flint. He's a former state representative and state senator, former state racing commissioner, and director of the Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulation. Mr. Ballinger also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in the administration of President Gerald R. Ford. Mr. Ballinger has a Bachelor of Arts degree, magna cum laude, from Princeton University, and a master's degree in public administration from Harvard University's JFK School of Government. He held the Robert P. and Marjorie Griffin Endowed Professorship in American Government at Central Michigan University from 2003 to 2007. He's also been a visiting adjunct at the University of Michigan-Flint, Michigan State University, and Western Michigan University. Now we're going to get to the really good part here. Much has been said about Bill over the years. He's been dubbed by the Detroit News as Michigan's undisputed crown prince of pundits. That's
crown, not clown.
Oh, crown. Very good, thank you. In addition to his work on Inside Michigan Politics, where I'm sure many of you are familiar with Bill from, he appears frequently on radio and television nationally and throughout Michigan. He also gives speeches and quotes to a variety of newspapers and various interest groups. We welcome Bill and thank you for your time with our panel today. Now, Eric Friedman, directly to my left, another distinguished panelist. Eric is a Pulitzer Prize winner and the Knight Chair in Environmental Journalism and Director of Capital News Service at MSU School of Journalism. Before joining the faculty full-time in 1996, Mr. Friedman was a reporter for the Albany, New York Knickerbocker News, and then for the Lansing Bureau of the Detroit News, primarily covering state government, politics, public affairs, and legal issues. He's a columnist for domemagazine.com and diverseeducation.com, and a frequent contributor to automotive news. Internationally, he has been a Fulbright Scholar at universities in Uzbekistan and Lithuania, and served as Associate Dean of International Studies and Programs at MSU. His academic research focuses on press coverage of the environment and other public policy issues, professional journalism practices, and international constraints on the press. He earned a bachelor's degree in government at Cornell, a law degree at NYU, and a master's in resource development from Michigan State. Thank you, Eric. And finally, Professor Cliff Lampy.
Get ready for a much more humble biography.
No less so important and distinguished, though. Professor Cliff Lampy is an associate professor in the School of Information at the University of Michigan. He's the director of the Citizen Interaction Design Program and co-director of the Social Media Research Lab. Dr. Lampy studies online behavior and how people use online tools to accomplish their pro-social goals. He has collaborated extensively with companies that you've heard of, namely Facebook and Google, in thinking about how people behave online and the effects of that behavior. So please take a second and join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. I'll turn the floor over to them, and Mr. Ballinger, if you would care to just kick our comments off.
Well, I'll just say, in contrast to what I heard, I think one of our previous speakers on the video panel this morning say, I think it's very hard to have an in-depth policy discussion on issues in less than 140 characters. And I think that is part of the problem. I do think that the internet, and whether it's email, whether it's Twitter, whatever it is, has contributed to at least the perception that we have a proliferation of incivility in our civic life and in our society. I think there's a real question whether we actually have more incivility, whether it's actually occurring more in the general population, whether it's occurring more in the general population's reaction to elected officials in government, whether it's happening within government. I think that's very questionable. And any of you who were here at the previous session at least saw the intro piece where he went back to Hamilton, which, as you know, is now a big rap musical hit on Broadway. Alexander Hamilton being assassinated by Aaron Burr. Preston Brooks, the South Carolina senator, beating Senator Sumner from Massachusetts with a cane on the Senate floor. All this incivility, and there are so many instances in the 19th century, it's unbelievable. Eric and I, covering Capitol politics, remember when State Representative Rosetta Ferguson threw an ashtray and bonked a fellow state representative on the head about 25 years ago on the House floor just below us. We had representatives like Dave Holmes and Tom Sharp, a Democrat and Republican, segue to the cloakroom and duke it out. We had a slugfest just about a dozen years ago on the Senate floor between John Kelly and Gil Danella. So, I mean, incivility has been going on a long time. One of our previous speakers talked about the ultimate definition of incivility being murder. He went through the murder rates of all the countries in the world and where America ranks compared to all the other countries, and where we rank compared to the European countries and Canada. And if that is the criteria by which you're going to measure incivility, I think actually we're doing pretty damn well as a country, and I don't think we're really doing that much worse than we ever have. In fact, we may be doing better. Look at the rise of political correctness in our society. For heaven's sakes, if that isn't an urge toward civility, maybe it's gone too far in many people's opinion, but it's certainly something you could hardly imagine existing 100 years ago or 200 years ago, the things that we are allowed to talk about only in certain ways. But if you want to look at scapegoats and villains, if you're convinced that we really do have a proliferation of incivility, you can look at talk radio, very polarizing, more of it than ever before. That's the point. You don't get the old so-called objective commentators that we think we grew up with. You get extreme left, extreme right, and even if they're not too extreme, they are so loud and they are so aggressive that they create the impression of this vast incivility and proliferation of and polarization of views. A lot of people like to point out term limits in the legislature, which is a handy villain for everybody if you're talking about public officials, because legislators don't get the chance to get to know each other over a period of time that they used to. They barely are getting to know each other, and they're out. They're done. In the House, 6 years, that's it. In the Senate, 8 years, that's it. Redistricting has created a situation, reapportionment of legislators, where you're getting more and more people coming from extremely Democratic or extremely Republican districts. They basically are pulled to the left and pulled to the right. That increases polarization. Political advertising, negative advertising, as you know, has become slicker and more powerful and more insidious and nastier than ever before. I think that hurts. And I think increasingly there's more a focus on winning elections at all costs rather than trying to put together great public policy. If you want a good example of two politicians I can think of, this is rare, probably everybody has forgotten about it already, people who don't agree on anything but got the job done about a year and a half ago. Remember Patty Murray, the liberal Democratic senator from the state of Washington, Paul Ryan, very conservative congressman from southern Wisconsin. Remember when they put together the deal to avoid the fiscal cliff and to, balance the budget and avoid what everybody thought was going to be a disaster? And they got up at a press conference in Washington, they said, we don't agree on anything, but we made this happen. This is what's going to happen. And I think David Matthews, for those of you who were here in the room a few minutes ago and heard him with the Kettering Foundation, he led off by saying, incivility is not a precondition to getting things done. It's the result. I mean, civility is not, let's turn it around. Civility is not a precondition to getting things done between competing groups or individuals. It's a result of their working together to get things done, even when they know going in they don't have that much in common with the other party. So that's what he led off with, and I would say that's kind of what you got from Patty Murray and Paul Ryan, and I think that's what we need more of in government and between groups, much more. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. There.
I'll approach the question from the perspective of a journalist because although I'm full-time on the faculty, I still think of myself more as a journalist who happens to have another day job. And as journalists, we love controversy and we love conflict. So incivility is good. It gives us things to write about. It might be more of the personality and horse race and less of the issues, but it gives us something to cover. Second, this entrenchment in history that Bill talked about, and I had actually jotted down some notes on some of the early incidents, which go back to 1798 in Congress, when one representative, U.S. representative, smashed a colleague over the head with a cane, to the incidents he described in this building. But it's happened even more recently. 2 years ago in California, 4 years ago in California, two members of the Assembly started duking it out on the floor of the State Assembly. In 2007, the last day of the session, a Republican senator punched one of his Democratic colleagues in the head before the two of them were pulled apart by their less violent but still partisan colleagues. And those incidents, the physical incidents, are aberrations, but we love them. And of course, nowadays they'll be on film and they'll be Facebook within seconds, they'll be tweeted. Next point, the traditional role of the media as gatekeepers, sorting out, trying for some balance and some fairness, as well as some of the outrage and entertainment, that's being bypassed by the new media. I think Cliff is going to talk a lot more about it, but the traditional sources, Bill walked in with a hard copy of the Wall Street Journal today, and there may have been another newspaper hidden under it. I talked to my students, they almost without exception don't subscribe to any print publications. They don't even pick up the Free City Pulse and the Free State News when they walk in the building, and they don't the young people don't go to the websites of the mainstream news organizations. The apps they have on their cell phones are not the New York Times app. So where are they getting their information? Multiple sources, sometimes relatively fair and biased, and unbiased sometimes, advocacy, often only partly informed. In theory, they're getting all these sources of information and they're making intelligent, well-reasoned decisions on how to vote or what to write to their senator about. But in reality, the pace of the flood of information makes it difficult for them to give any meaningful thought to what they're reading or hearing or viewing. Next, this rapid dissemination of information. There are no do-overs. George talked about hitting the emails, but it's not just that. It's the tweets and the posts. I pulled out this story just a few weeks ago. ESPN suspended Keith Olbermann for remarks he made about Penn State. Now, in either Ann Arbor or East Lansing, remarks about the sports teams at Penn State may be welcome, but it didn't go over too well, and he got suspended from his job. And we expect commentators to be provocative. They want audiences, but where do they draw the line? And then if they've stepped over the line electronically, it's all over the place. And you can't delete. You run a correction the next day in the New York Times. We said William Ballinger with a V instead of a B. We're sorry about it. That's too late. My final point, and this is from the perspective of both a journalist and someone who hears from a lot of advocates, particularly on political and environmental issues, is we're in an era of false balance. We teach journalism students and young professionals to be fair and balanced and accurate and ethical. And then when you come to Democrats against Republicans, immigration, healthcare, there are two, and often well more than two, diverse viewpoints with evidence to support or refute them. We come to climate change, we come to vaccination, we come to evolution, and mainstream news organizations, I think, are often going overboard to find the climate denier or to find the evolution denier, whether in Congress or not, to give the appearance of fairness and thus to create a dispute when there scientifically isn't. And it's not just there. Years ago, when I was a reporter in Albany, I had a colleague who wrote, "A spokesman for the mafia could not be reached for comment." Well, and of course, the mafia may have other ways to comment other than to answer a reporter's question. But in a sense, we're sometimes provoking more of the incivility by giving an audience to those whose views are totally unsupported and unsupportable. So, thanks, sir.
Thank you, Eric. So I'm going to start off with a provocative statement that says that internet and social media are not the problem in terms of promoting incivility. As both Eric and Bill have said, I think we're not sure. We don't know if there is more incivility as a result of the internet or not, right? I think that the idea that we have more perception of incivility because of the internet is a really fair point. And there's a few reasons why that might be, right? One is that that things that appear on social media are more public. More people can see them. If I was incivil 50 years ago, it might have been kept hush, and it would have happened behind closed doors, and people might not have seen it. If I'm incivil on Twitter, it's immediately seen by a lot of people. There's context collapse, which is basically more social groups get together than would have been able to get together in the past, right? In previous environments, we had ways of keeping people separate. So only certain people went to certain churches, only certain people went to certain meetings, public meetings even. And in Twitter, everybody is available, or in Facebook. And so that context collapse actually makes more incivility more apparent to more people. The third thing that really contributes to the perception is that the tweets and the social media messages are less ephemeral. If I say something uncivil in a public space, it's gone, and I have to depend on eyewitness accounts. If I say it in social media, it's recorded, and as much as we think of social media as being ephemeral, it's archived and it's available for quite a while, actually.
It's too late to pull it back.
It's too late to pull it back. Yeah, absolutely. So the maxims are a good idea. So let's push that aside to a second, though, and let's imagine that internet is the problem, right? Imagine that the internet is the cause of incivility. There are multiple theories for why this might be. The first one is what's called the de-individuation theory. This is the mob theory. This is the idea that when people get together on the internet, having basically their identity suppressed causes them to actually act less like themselves, right? And I think this is the most common folk theory about why people misbehave on the internet. It's absolutely wrong, right? There's a 100-year history in sociology showing that this theory of de-individuation does not happen, and that it's actually something very different at work in mob behavior like this. Another theory that's more current is the idea that malicious micronorms propagate in systems where there's not a strong positive norm, right? So the work on this, for instance, if you have somebody who's about to jump off a bridge, inevitably there's somebody who will shout, "Jump," right? That's a really uncivil thing to do, it turns out. But that call gets taken up. In the lack of knowing what to do, people will grab onto a norm of how to behave, and that norm becomes the dominant norm, right? So that's another reason that people talk about. There are some ideas that text environments have features that suppress feedback loops, right? So if I say something uncivil to you, I'll see like, your face will flush, your eyes will widen, your fists might come up and things like that. I have lots of cues about how you're reacting to something I have said. In a text environment, I don't have that. So I don't have a perception of how you're interpreting what I'm saying. And that might contribute to feelings of incivility. There's a moral reasoning argument that people make. Because there's no consequences, people can get away with saying things in online forums that they could not say in public events, right? I could not, for instance, make a comment in this forum. Eventually, if I started being uncivil, somebody would show me the door, right? Whereas in an online forum, it's a much murkier situation. Another idea is democratization. That what happens online is that the tools are bringing more people to participate, that what social media has done different than the gatekeeping function of mass media is to allow people a voice. Now that's good or bad. So that it could be that really just people do disagree about this and people really are that mean, right? Like that's very possible here. The problem becomes is where do you go from encouraging civility to shutting down legitimate voices and concerns? Right, my alma mater, Kalamazoo College, is going through a horrific week right now, where a lot of people of color do not feel safe at that college at the moment. What's civil in terms of their discourse that they're having is really taking place on Twitter and Facebook right now, and how that's being shaped isn't so much a matter of people being uncivil, it's that they really do disagree about things, right? And sometimes they disagree passionately. The other thing to think about that is often when we talk about incivility, we're talking about it from a place of cultural hegemony, right? We want people to act how we want them to act. Especially as policymakers, what we want are for people to tell us the things we want to hear and then to not say the things we don't want to hear. So I've heard, especially policymakers, confound sometimes incivility with disagreement. Not all of them, many of them actually have very sophisticated awareness of this, but that's a danger, right? Not all disagreement is uncivil. And then I think another thing to consider is the heterogeneity of motivation for people who participate in these forums. Not everybody's in there to have public discourse. Some people are there to be amused. Some people are there to cause problems because it amuses them. Some people are there to really just promote their partisan viewpoint, right? So to have the idea that everybody's there to have a civic discourse is probably not the right way to go. And then finally, I think there's been a general unwillingness to moderate behavior. Most of the forums that we mostly concern ourselves with are actually owned by mainstream media sources, but they have been entirely unwilling to create safe spaces for people to communicate. I think they misinterpret this as a First Amendment issue. They're always hesitant to suppress speech, which is good for our journalists to do. But they don't see it as creating a peaceful place to assemble. Right? So they're trading off basically an interpretation of a right to make a comment versus an interpretation of creating a place of assembly. Because when you have a nasty set of trolls who are saying mean things in a forum, you're chasing away good-hearted people who would participate in a positive discussion, right? And so the unwillingness to moderate these forums creates a really bad situation. So good news, I'll end on a couple pieces of good news. One is this is fixable. Right? It really is. If we have the courage to implement solutions, we know that we can create forums that are productive and collaborative. We know this because there are forums out there that are productive and collaborative. Slashdot, Metafilter, some sections of Reddit all have technical and social solutions that make it so they actually have very productive conversations. The tech part is easy, right? That's super easy, but it's not a magic bullet. 90% of the solution is going to be social. That social solution is going to be to set rules about what counts as civility in an online forum and stick to those rules, right? Suppress comments, and you unfortunately have to do that, and users who violate those rules. That's what we do in regular life, offline, is we have norms and we have rules for how we behave, and we sanction people who do not behave that way. We can do that online. I think also a lot of the people who are coming to these online forums, even though they're not content producers, have never been trained in how to argue. Right? They've never had to think about how do I disagree with somebody in such a way that I don't want to smash their face. So training younger people and people in the K-12 system to have disagreements that don't end in just polarization is going to be a really essential part of this puzzle over the next few years. And then I think, keeping people, aligning people's incentives to participate in these systems with this idea of discourse is going to be hugely important. If I'm running the Wall Street Journal comments, or if I'm running MLife's comments, I need to think about who's producing this content and how can I make it into their incentive to actually produce civil commentary, right? If they're here to be amused, you know, frankly, civil comments often aren't very amusing. So how do I meet their incentives at the same time as creating the environment I want to create? So internet is not the problem, it's just a channel, it's just a communication tool like any other tool. Social media is not the problem, but how we use them, how we have allowed them to run wild, that is definitely the problem.
Would you mind, Cliff, sharing with the audience that quote about radio?
Yeah.
Do you have that handy?
So there's a long history of Techno Panics. Every time there's a new technology, people worry about that technology basically destroying society. So when the radio first became popular, a critic declared, "There's now very little danger that Americans will resort to the vice of thinking. The death of conversation is here. It will be replaced by the rattle and bang of incredibly frightful jazz." There's similar anecdotes like that for telephone, for television. Every technology has caused a panic about what it means for us as a society.
So, first off, thank you to our three panelists for sharing your opening thoughts on the subject. I think there's some very provocative and interesting points in here. I'd like to open it to the audience if you have direct questions, if there's assertions that you want to challenge, examples from your own life in terms of what we were talking about today that you've experienced or seen recently, because I'm sure our three panelists would be more than happy to continue their side of the conversation, but I'd like to hear from the audience as well. Jesus.
I have a question for all you guys, primarily directed at John earlier. It's regarding anonymity on the internet and how that relates to civilian internet. So it seems like I saw a documentary recently about Anonymous that hacked this group, and it seems like when I got out of it, that anonymity sometimes leads to instability online because you're not afraid of saying or speaking your mind. They talked about 4chan forum where Anonymous was going on, and they said it was pretty much the opposite of Facebook. That Facebook was like, this is me, this is my life, this is what I do, this is where I work, etc. Whereas on 4chan, you don't really hang out with your friends, and you can say whatever you want, you just have like a law keeping expression, and that's why there's a general tendency for just to be completely obscene, profane things on 4chan. And you have Yik Yak too. It's kind of complicated. You have examples with anonymity, like on Yik Yak and Reddit, and it's not a thing. People have direct conversations, and on the flip side, of 4chan and other things. So I guess my question is just, does anonymity inevitably lead to incivility online?
The answer is no, it does not. So anonymity has been the big, I think, whipping horse of people in terms of what causes bad behavior. YouTube, for instance, has the worst comments of any internet site that's out there. And they tried to fix this problem by basically getting rid of anonymous comments. They still have the worst comments of any internet site out there. 4chan is an extreme example, but 4chan is not the anonymity that causes their bad behavior to some extent. It's the culture of 4chan. 4chan is about behaving badly. That's the whole purpose of that site to a large extent, right? And when you see on Yik Yak, you see a lot of, I think, self-regulation on Yik Yak. So if anybody here not know Yik Yak, if you don't know it, you should. Yik Yak is a mobile, anonymous, ephemeral social media application that's heavily used on college campuses, blocked or supposed to be on high school campuses.
Are you encouraging incivility?
I hope not. But you do get very frank conversations, and sometimes you get racist, misogynist types of things, and the community always responds to that, often reduces those comments or removes them. So there's a lot of power in that anonymous form.
If we're going to get just a quick interesting comment, there is a student who was recently in trouble that you guys are both sorry about in the state news. He posted online saying, "I'm going to gun emoji the school today," and he got trouble for terrorism.
Good.
Yeah.
Real probation too.
And it's supposedly anonymous on the internet, but it just goes to show you.
Terry.
Yeah, this springs off of one of Bill's comments at the front end about one of the tensions that might be driving incivility. And it relates actually to both something that Cliff said in his remark when he mentioned the word debate, and also what Eric said when he was talking about, it's around the word competition. And here's the question that's been bouncing around in my head a lot, especially since the new biology and the new science tells us that there's a whole lot more going on in the trillion interactions going on within each of our bodies a year that's collaborative and competitive. And yet, the news hole with the Lansing State Journal has more about competition in sports and probably more sports writers in sports. And as someone who ran recently for elected office, the concept of having debates so we can pick a winner and a loser is a totally different frame than if we were to have Mitt Romney and Barack Obama up here, not seeing who can win a debate, but what we need is ideas that can emerge from that. And we don't get that when it's about winning and losing. So the role comes back to where can media, instead of focusing on winning and losing, be this force that creates possibility. There's, within the facilitative world, that's looking at new ways to get people to be civil and create options. It's what's called choice creation. And if we bring more people into the room, there's a possibility of more choices. If we silence and narrow it down to two, it's either win or lose. So what role could we come to that allows some synergies around moving away from the dominance of competition? And what do you think about
In the news media in particular?
Well, yeah, I think because it's still, in whatever format that people get information, the news media is still a big player. And at this point, as someone who was running for office, I didn't really care if I got elected. What I really want is the ideas that I believe in to be heard and discussed. And if you shut those out because you're only talking about the horse races, where you shut out minor party candidates where a lot of the ideas percolate from, we lose the possibility. That's the word, I think, possibility.
You're appealing to our better angels, there's no question about that. Unfortunately, we're down in the muck as journalists, or I think much of the profession and society as a whole, and everybody loves a horse race, and it's easy. You know, honestly, I was just thinking as you were talking, you know, for years, we've been hearing now for 15 years about the Sunnis and the Shiites, right? To this day, I mean, I could easily go figure out what really is the difference between Shia and the Sunnis, but honest to God, you don't see any easy or even medium depth explanation of what the difference. All you hear all the time, ad nauseum, every night on the news is this country is dominated by Shia, this is by Sunni, the Sunnis here, the Shias there. Who the hell are the Sunnis and the Shias? Why do they differ? Why can't, as David Matthews say, well, let's get together here and we got a common purpose even though we don't like each other and work toward a solution. I mean, there's no explanation. Journalism could do it, society could do it, I don't hear it. And there's always the quick and easy fallback on the horse race. Who's ahead in the polls? Polling, my God. I mean, I remember watching gubernatorial races in the 1970s in this state, and you had to scratch to get a poll. One every 6 weeks or 2 months leading up to the election. People were going crazy. Who's ahead? You know, what's the lead? How many undecided? Today, we are awash in polls. And what is that? It's a horse race. I mean, every single day, it's how much has one candidate improved his situation in the last 12 hours. You know, as to why? Is it based on an ad that's on TV? Probably, whatever. But where is the discussion of the real issues and the coming together in the civic square? Like the old New England classic supposed town meeting, if it ever existed, that you were alluding to. And I think it's really commendable that you ran with one of your major ideas being, for God's sakes, let's talk about this stuff. Let's talk about issues that we can't, I can't, you can't see covered and discussed anywhere else. Maybe if I get in a campaign and I demand that this be talked about, and I talk about it, it'll provoke a response. I don't know, that's my reaction.
I'll just make two brief comments. First, Bill covered the horse race thing, but he didn't give you the two cliches. One is the pollster's answer, it's only a snapshot in time. And whoever's trailing in the polls, the only poll that counts is on election day. But Terry raised a good question, not just about the minor candidates, but within the mainstream two-party system. If you're a metropolitan newspaper, I worked at the Detroit News, we had a lot of congressional districts, we had more then than we have now. We paid attention, even within the southeast Michigan area where most readers were, to the races that we decided were competitive. So John Conyers wouldn't get a whole lot of attention. He could have just been redistricted, even if there was a primary. But some of the suburban districts that we determined, they may get a story, and the other races get multiple stories. It's not a question of fairness, it's partly a question of resources and space and time, and what we think that our readers in those districts would rather read about or don't care about, because although the blind acorn, the blind pig sometimes gets the acorn and the sure loser sometimes wins, and we've had those experiences here, that's not how we allocate journalistic resources. So the issues that a Democrat running against Dave Camp all those years would have raised doesn't get covered much, whether it's by the Midland paper or the Metro papers. It happens.
Yes, sir. So if I'm using the internet, space is not a constraint. And Mr. Ballinger, you talked about where is the real discussion of the issues. And so that leads me back to a comment that you made quite a bit earlier when you were saying that there are forums that are productive, that have the rules and norms for behavior. So what's the research or what's the source to actually know what are the most effective rules and norms and behavior to establish it? A city or municipality is trying to start a discussion board on the website.
A good first step is to have any rules for behavior. If you look at one of the comments that we worry most about, there aren't really any posting rules, or at least the rules are so extreme, like you can't physically threaten somebody, or you can't use one of Carlin's words or something like that, right? So, but that, of course, neither of those are really related to civility at the end of the day. So setting up a set of rules. So the Reddit site, Our Serious Discussion, which is kind of their very serious discussion forum, has a huge set of rules, right? Like a long list. You actually have to do reading materials and go through kind of a little quiz before you're allowed to post, right? Like, for instance, you have to accept the concept of privilege in their forum before you're allowed to post and read and know what that means and be able to talk, be able to identify what cis means and all that stuff. So Slashdot sets the rules for they set norms. They have rating systems such that I can vote a comment up or down. I can vote it down because it's flaming or down because it's a troll comment, and it will disappear below a threshold. They allow totally anonymous comments, but they call their anonymous commenters anonymous cowards, right? Which sets up basically a norm for how you post these things and what it means to have rules. And then the other where we see this to be effective is where there are rules for inclusion and exclusion, right? So when you look at sites that have productive forums, they ban users who break the norms too many times, right? Just as I would kick out a patron out of my bar who violated my rules too many times, they ban users. When I worked for Slashdot way back in the day, we would ban 4 or 5 users a day who could not behave themselves, right? And it worked. You know, it kept things civil. It got rid of, because 90% of the problem is caused by 0.5% of the users, right? And if you can get rid of that 0.5% of the users, you're actually in pretty good shape.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Just a couple things that you commented on, Cliff, and I think they really cut across the boundaries beyond just media and whether or not you're on social media, and just kind of looking at what Terry said about having some level of facilitated leadership and people who will absolutely, step forward and have both the willingness, and power support to support certain kind of behavior. So if something's going down and you call it out, are people in the room going to stand with you, or are you going to be there? And being able to know that you can create an environment like that and to set that kind of parameter. So as a leader, you know, somebody who's holding a space, you know, having already established that for yourself, that I'm going to hold this space. And you let people know that before you even start the conversation, that this space is being held in this way. And I think a lot of that happens, you talked about people being unwilling to moderate behavior because people are afraid of what's going to happen to them if they do. You know, and so a lot of times we tolerate stuff. We just kind of like, you know, go to the beach somewhere while it's happening, and we check back in when we think they're finished, or, you know, and we just let it happen. And you're right, it does squash a lot of really good things that could occur, you know, in rooms. So I think that whole development of people and folks who kind of rise up and take that facilitative leadership role, not an easy place to stand in, but we need more people standing in that way.
Yeah, if I had a policy idea, it would be to basically create a core of people who went out and were civil in online discussion forums and called out people who were being uncivil, right? Like, and sometimes it's just as easy as pointing it out, right? Like, look, you don't have to call me an idiot. We disagree. That's okay that we disagree, you know, and that would be a tremendous help.
One of the things that I have wondered about, and having heard would be, you had mentioned the allocation of journalistic resources. And it would appear to those of us who aren't in the area of journalism but read it, that the resources are shrinking incredibly. Just here locally, go to the LSJ. The newspaper today is not the newspaper of 10, definitely not 20 years ago. You know, we all hear about the staff's declining, the competition for writing, and the digital world, and the online newsletters and the online blogs that are written by those who proclaim they are journalistic professionals giving their unbiased opinions, which when you have unbiased opinions, can you do those together? But sometimes put together a pretty nifty newsletter and also maybe have the mindset of knowing, gee, if I intertwine some feel-good articles by some people that are well-respected, then that draws people to read those and kind of go, hey, maybe I should read this because I know that person and that is this. But then intertwined again is there. They have not gone through what journalists used to, I believe, go through in integrity and in knowing that their facts are straight. So in the world of journalism today, I keep waiting and wishing that there would be leadership in those journalistic areas where you're educated people and professors of that area to kind of speak against, you know, you can't tout that you're a professional journalist by having your own newsletter and proclaiming that called fact. I mean, how will that ever all balance out in our digital world versus the real professionals, I guess?
You want to bring back Walter Cronkite. We're looking for everybody's looking for Walter. Go ahead.
And Brian Williams did.
Brian.
Well, we
can never find him.
Go ahead, Cliff.
So this is the blessing and curse of the journalism profession as I understand it. They have wonderful professional ethics, they have great professional practice, but they don't have a professional association that, like doctors or lawyers do, that brand somebody as, you know, official journalist, right? So anybody can hang up a sign, whether they've gone through the training or had the experience or been taught by great people like Eric. So as long as there's not kind of a marker to say this is acceptable practice versus this isn't, otherwise you lose your professional license to journal, there's not any way you can regulate those types of things. So I think what you do is you just call it out, right? Like I would love to see an association of journalists who basically found the worst cases of bad journalism online and highlighted it. That would be fun. And you have some of that, Media Matters and what Scopes does and things like that. They do a lot of that.
Well, the closest you get around here is this little pass that gets you to sit in the press section in the House and Senate chambers. And you know, I think it's good that news organizations aren't licensed individual journalists, however they call themselves. When Oprah had her TV show, was she a journalist? Well, she was doing journalistic things, and she was also a magazine publisher. But you're absolutely right about the shrinking staff sizes. It's not just the LSJ, it's the New York Times, it's the networks. Anybody read National Geographic? You still get it? Wading down your basement, sinking to the center of the earth. We had Susan Goldberg, who is both a journalism school alum and the new editor-in-chief of National Geographic magazine, on campus a few weeks ago. She did public lectures, she came to our classes, she did some speed networking. And for our students, your dream job is ESPN, CNN, New York Times, National Geographic, Cosmo. It's the glitzy news organizations, almost all of which are cutting their traditional news staff. Some of it's being replaced by the designers and the infographics people who are still doing journalism, but almost all the articles and photos you see in your magazine, National Geographic, every month, are done by freelancers. She calls them people under contract, but they're no longer staff. There are staff who do the National Geographic News, which is the 24/7 science environment, anthropology news, but they're not the ones that you see in the magazine. And it's the economics of National Geographic the magazine makes a lot of money. It's part of an empire which does movies, it has a TV channel, it does books. Anybody seen the exhibit in Grand Rapids called Real Pirates? It's at the public museum there. It's about a slave ship that then became a pirate ship and then sank, and it's been recovered. National Geographic organized that exhibition. So there are people who do journalistic things within the company who we don't think of as journalists, but many of even those designers and exhibitions, they're not all on staff. The editors of the books, adult books, children's books, some of those are outsiders. And it drives, those economic realities drive people to leave journalism and make a living in public relations or corporate communications, so they work for DNR or the legislature. And it's the economics and marketplace that we're in.
Wasn't Susan Goldberg, the Detroit Free Press's first female reporter ever sent to cover the state capitol back in the mid-80s?
We overlapped, and that would have been in the early 80s.
Yeah,
Yep.
early 80s. Let me just mention just one quick thing, kind of bridging back to what I said before. I actually don't agree with what you just said about, and it relates to what Eric said, and he's talking about traditional news media shrinking. Yes, it's shrinking. I believe there's far more information out there on the internet and the traditional news media combined. If you look for it, if you search for it, if you really want to find it, it's there to a greater extent than ever in history. When I talked earlier about the difference between Shia and Sunnis, I could go on this afternoon, get it, in a heartbeat. I'm talking about the media, mainstream, whether it's newspapers and everyday parlance and conversation. You just don't hear anybody make an attempt to differentiate between Shia and Sunni, and it's so key to what's going on in the Middle East and what's been happening with terrorism for 15 years. It's just not even discussed. Nobody even takes a pass at defining it. But if each one of us or any one of us wants to get online, find out what the hell is going on with Shia, Sunni, what are they, why are they different, where is one dominant, where is one weak, it's there. And I think there's more coverage and information today than ever before.
One more thing, if you're interested in state government politics, and you're not going to get stories in depth covering everything in the State Journal, the Free Press, my buddy Rick Pluta, the Detroit News, MLive. Well, if you want to pay, you can get door-to-door, gavel-to-gavel coverage in MERS, Inside Michigan Politics, Gongwer. People pay for the information.
Specialty newsletters, they're very expensive, that's the problem, much of the time.
But they do good journalism.
Really good.
So with that, we're a few minutes over, and I want to make sure we have time to get downstairs to see the second half of our theater performance. If there's one very quick question left out in the audience, I can entertain that. And super quick, Melissa?
Okay, because kind of piggybacking off of some things that Annette and Terry said, because I think there's a lot of like onus of like the problem being placed on the media, but some of these things are being driven by business decisions, by the number of clicks. And we have more people who are participating in the decisions that are being made about what story makes it to the top. There's this really funny Onion article around the time of the Grammys with Miley Cyrus, and had like a CNN editor on there who was like, you know, the reason why, because people were complaining about how much coverage it was getting, and it's satire, but this fictional person was saying the reason why this story is getting coverage is because you click on it. So I guess how much of the problem, well, you know, if there is a problem, how much of the problem is consumer choices? And I've heard, you know, saturation with media, but I've also heard that it's not that there's too much information out there, it's what we decide to do with our time and what we decide to consume that's the issue. So, I mean, if you guys could comment on that, that'd be great.
30 seconds sort of reach that subject.
Yes, and millennials have better filters for that than we who are not millennials do, because they were born and raised in that environment. So they tend to have better filters. We need better, I think, ways of determining fact and fiction. The information is out there. What we need to do now is to sort out important information from non-important information, and that's going to differ by the audience too.
Thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank our panel again.